Our next mighty fine poet is a very mighty fine poet indeed, and a fellow misanthrope. His name is Eli Neal.
They're a bit rough still, but we'll figure out how to read them. This one's called Sometimes I Wonder If Grandpa Russ's Thumb Ever Found Him in Heaven. It was one of those hazy, overcast, eternally gray Ohio days, the type that stretch on for weeks, the sun always lurking behind smoky clouds, until you forget what it looks like. The old oak was still sprawled out across the hill, splintered, shattered, and burnt. A whole family of squirrels, rigid and singed, had plunged to the ground when the lightning struck. My little brother prodded one with a stick and ran off giggling. My uncle ran his hands over the smooth black plastic and blinked repeatedly. "Oh my God," my grandmother cried. "We nearly forgot his thumb." He'd lost it 35 years prior. A 20-something farm boy, slick back hair, broad smile, and rough palm. A new girl with platinum blonde hair, a new dump truck with dusty chrome. One afternoon, the tailgate smashed down, cracking the knuckle. Somehow he yanked it free, wrapped it in an oil-stained rag, and drove himself to the hospital. Blood pooling on the floor of the truck, a crimson puddle. A year later, he was married. Late at night, when my mother finally fell asleep, as my grandma nodded off behind a waterlogged book, he slipped the thumb into his pocket and grinned as he thrust it into her face, sending her screaming across the house. Grandma came back, a blue ring box in her palm held at arm's length. Slowly, she reached the other shaking hand forward and flipped it open. A nicotine yellow, perfectly preserved, mummified thumb. No one ever could figure out how it survived all those years, locked away in his top dresser drawer amongst broken watches and satin ties. Perhaps perfect air conditions, or the doctors dosed it in chemicals, or it never really died. Whatever the reason, on a small farm in Ohio that once held a childhood worth of memories, beneath a few feet of topsoil, there's a plastic box that holds everything that was my grandpa. 2 pounds of ashes, a blue velvet ring box, and a dry, yellow thumb. This one's called Bed Springs. It's still pretty rough, but I really like it. It was your bed from childhood, wasn't it? Long before the cold steel turned to rust and pried their way outward, when you were a girl with smoky blue eyes and hair the color of fields turning under a frozen October morning, the smoke of your father's cigarette hanging in the breathless air. I like to imagine blue winter nights, the Kansas wind sweeping across frozen fields, the barn doors swinging open, creaking on rusted hinges, and you bouncing on new springs, before laying your damp, dirty blonde hair on a little pink pillow, the moon looming like a lantern that might spill flames across the blank sky, and nodding off into dreams of dusty gravel roads, wild horses, and dark-haired princes. The first night was an accident, or something close. Everything smelled of cheap whiskey. It hung in the air, poured out from our breath. You tripped, and we landed on the bed with a bounce and a creak. Despite the foam padding you'd had over the years, the bed was giving out, even back then. The last time we slept together was on a different bed. You were passing your time outside of Chicago, handing fine china to faceless money, refilling crystal glasses with Kettle One, and the slightest of curtsies. I was just passing through on the tail end of a whiskey bench that stretched from the humid hills of Arkansas to the brisk Michigan beaches. The bed was brand new. There was no creaking as I threw you across it, or when I collapsed, gasping for breath, dripping with sweat beside you, only sterile sheets and the thick smoke trailing up from my cigarette. By the time I stumbled back here, my mind hissed like an unoiled machine. My ribs stuck from my sides, my eyes darted back and forth, pausing only to slide down a curve or spiral through a blonde curl. Then I'd light another cigarette and take a slow pull from the bottle. I didn't have a bed then. I was spending my days shuffling from living room to living room, a perpetual fog of purple smoke filled every corner. At night, I curled up on one beer-stained couch or another. Most nights, I wrapped my arms tight around a blanket and tried to hold your steel blue eyes in focus. But there were nights when I tried to replicate the sound of those rusty springs creaking as we rocked them back and forth on a couch that was not your bed, with twisting bodies that were not yours. It had been promised months before the thousands of miles of wire between our voices turned conversations into static. You would not need it when you returned. A new bed would be arriving, one that did not groan with our every movement, one that did not smell of whiskey or cigarettes. So it had been promised to me. My father was with me when I retrieved it. The house was empty. All that remained was stale smoke, the crooked, cracked walls of your room looming ever closer. Worn orange carpet, and the bed stripped of its sheets, the thick foam padding we used to protect it from its springs. We took to bed in silence. Hurrying down the alley, I tripped over a broken bottle and nearly dropped it. When Destiny rushed in an hour later and pulled me outside, she spoke in a quick, hushed tone. A single dead, withered leaf fell from a tree behind her and spiraled down to the pulsing gravel. My mother asked questions. My father ran a hand through his hair and asked me to help take the bed upstairs. Destiny's asleep now. 6 times the moon is hung full and burning in the window above the bed. 6 times I've been certain the fire would spill across the black ink of the sky. For a while we taught the springs how to sing, the notes to love songs. But they always preferred the blues, the wandering chords of Bob Dylan's harmonica, Robert Johnson's fingers plucking tight steel strings. Destiny rolled over in her sleep, tossed a dry froth of nicotine and resin, and the bed moans just slightly. I light a cigarette, and the moon swells into my window, and the rusted steel coils and prods against my spine.